Embattled Senator Don Meredith will soon learn his professional fate as the Senate Ethics Committee decides what, if anything, to do about his relationship with the 16-year-old girl. The committee met Wednesday amid calls for Meredith to be booted from the upper chamber after a damning report from the Senate ethics officer. Last week, Meredith publicly apologized for what he calls a moral failing, but he insists he only had sex with the girl after she turned 18. Joining me now is University of Ottawa law professor Carissima Mathen. She's an expert in constitutional law. Professor, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
All right, let's look at the Don Meredith case. Is he truly at risk of being expelled from the upper chamber?
Well, he could be. It depends on how far the Senate wants to take it. Virtually every senator who's spoken on this, with one or two exceptions, has said they're appalled by his behavior and they've urged him to resign. The issue is it's a little tricky as to whether he can be forced out. There is a provision in our Constitution that provides for the disqualification of senators, but it only sets out 5 circumstances, everything from non-attendance to being convicted of a crime. And Don Meredith's situation doesn't fit those circumstances, so what else can they do? They can, under their own rules, suspend him, as they suspended Mike Duffy, essentially put him on an involuntary leave of absence without pay, but they have to renew that every session of Parliament. The only other possibility, which has never been done before, is to say that because the Senate is linked historically to the United Kingdom Parliament, it enjoys the same privileges as that body, which would include the right to expel its own members should it see fit. It's never been done in Canada before, and the Senate would have to decide what's the process. Would you have almost a mini trial in the Senate? What threshold would you need? Would a mere majority be enough? Would you need a supermajority? All those things could get very complicated.
Professor, there was also outcry over Senator Len Beack's comments saying that there were positive aspects to Canada's residential school system. So is there any way losing public support could lead to losing your seat?
That's a really interesting question. There's no doubt that Senator Beack's comments have caused an outcry both in and outside the Senate. We have to remember that historically, and even today, the reason for the Senate was to provide a sober second thought that is unlinked to popular support. So in that sense, it would be perhaps risky to start disciplining senators based on the popularity of what they say. Senators' comments were made in the course of debate on the floor of the Senate, and that's something to which we would generally attach a value to free expression, free flow of ideas. But there's no question that her comments were, in my opinion, very ill-informed, ill-advised, and we can see informal pressure being applied to her to, for example, recuse herself from the Aboriginal Peoples Committee on which she sits. But on the basis simply of her comments in debate, I would be skeptical that she would be removed or disciplined. I think that might be a step too far for most senators.
Professor, I'd like to circle back to what we talked about, touched on earlier. What are the reasons a senator could be expelled?
Well, none of the reasons that are listed in the Constitution apply. You know, those range from losing your real property, which you need to be appointed a senator, to an issue with your residence. If they wanted to expel him using this privilege that they would say historically exists in the Senate, they'd really be breaking new ground, and they would have to determine the process that would apply, what would be the nature of the debate, to what extent would Senator Meredith get to have a say, and certainly they could argue that his behavior has brought the Senate into disrepute and that would be sufficient, and there seems to be general support for that idea, but you want to be careful that you don't open a door to senators just being booted willy-nilly, because they are supposed to have that tenure until the age of 75.
You know, a lot of senators have been behaving badly in recent years, and senators are supposed to be upstanding citizens. I know that the Trudeau Liberals have rejigged how they appoint senators, but what are the requirements in terms of appointment to the Senate?
Well, the technical requirements are very few. You have to be 30 years of age. You have to be resident in the province from which you are appointed to sit in the Senate. you have to have a certain amount, a very minimal amount of real property in the amount of $4,000. Then there are all the intangible qualities that the Prime Minister, for example, has set out in this process that he unveiled last year that relates to a diversity of skills and life experience, being able to relate to people of different backgrounds, just what can you actually bring to the very important role that the Senate has. So certainly you want people of sound judgment, some intellect, education, but also diversity of experience. So it really is meant to reflect the panoply of talents that Canadians have. But in terms of the technical requirements, they are very few.
Very few indeed. Well, Carissima Mathen, thank you so much for joining us this morning.